Back in the mid-60s, my mate Dave and I decided to go and see the Loco Sheds at Patricroft. At school, fellow spotters described the place like an El Dorado of steam, full of rare locos. All this just a few miles east of Manchester. So we saved up pocket money and did odd jobs like car washing and gardening to get enough cash for a day out to El Dorado. 3 weeks later, 2 excited 14-year-old boys boarded the train from Stalybridge to Victoria, then found a Salford Corporation bus that went towards Eccles. I can't remember the number now, perhaps it was a 54, but the clippy gave us the tip to get off near the Queen's Arms and look for Hampden Grove. Once off the bus, it looked like any other northern industrial town of that time. Smoke-blackened buildings, dark satanic mills, and of course, a canal. This fine photo is quite near to where we landed in Patricroft. You can just see the railway crossing the canal and a set of signals. When we got off, there was a big works across from the Queen's Arms that had made locomotives and had developed their own patent steam hammer. The very kind lady who allowed me to use her image here said that when she was growing up, the sound of the big steam hammer from Nasmyth's Bridgewater Works had filled the air like a great heartbeat. We took a quick look at Patricroft Station and were just in time to see a freight run through. The place was typically very grubby and tired looking, but it seemed busy. Well, this was the Manchester to Liverpool line after all. Then we headed for Hampden Grove, and a footbridge at the top of some tall steps. A Stanier hooter announced the presence of a Class 5 running underneath with a freight. Meanwhile, locos were moving on and off the shed, slipping as they negotiated the point work. I had a rush of adrenaline. We were so close. I was imagining all those exotic locos. Would we get in, or would we be turfed off? We made a huge effort to casually walk across the footbridge, even though we wanted to run. But an official-looking old geezer eyeballed us. We stopped, nonchalantly pretending to be just taking in the scenery. There's plenty of it. Locos everywhere, moving about or taking their ease in front of the shed. It was no hardship to stand there. Some of our mates went shed bashing on Sundays, when all the locos would be at home and there would be very few shed staff about. But we preferred the busy to and fro of a weekday shed, with locos moving about purposefully. Plus the excitement of not being caught, if I'm honest. And yes, we did dodge school. Eventually, the old guy walked away and we made our move. We didn't see any exotic locos, but instead there was a crab, some tankies, and a lot of black 5s and 8s. Then again, we did see a Britannia and a couple of 9Fs, which was really something. I think we were lucky to get round before the last rites of 67-68, when everything really went to pot. In the mid-60s, you still occasionally saw a cleanish loco. As at Newton Heath a couple of weeks before, there was a massive coaling tower, which, I was told, the locals called King Kong's Piano. Hilarious. In this photo of 73050 underneath the coaling stage, you can see a wagon that's just been lowered, having ejected its load into the stage itself. There are also 2 bollards, presumably for handling the empty wagons. Everywhere seems rather untidy in this photo, symptomatic of the last days of steam, I guess. The coaling tower at Patricroft was built in 1934 and held 300 tons of coal. An ash disposal plant was built at the same time. Prior to that, the old LNWR pattern combined water tank and coaling stage was used. When we visited, the space underneath it was full of spare brake blocks and fire bars. There was a turntable with 2 roads leading to it in the angle of the 2 sheds. In the newer shed, we saw a couple of standard 262s. They always seemed plucky little locos, punching above their weight, and I remembered them from taking the train on the old Cheshire lines to see my gran. They had quite a turn of speed with only 2 coaches behind them. The main loco shed was built by the LNWR in 1885, and the slightly newer one in 1904. The old shed was rebuilt by BR in 1956, with vertical corrugated metal on the gable end. I wondered about the sort of locos that once must have called this shed home. Some real old LNWR types, no doubt. Dave scribbled down numbers like a boy possessed, although most of the staff didn't seem to be able to see us. One young fireman did warn us quietly that Old Will was coming, that we'd better watch out. I think he must have been referring to the shed foreman. It added another level of excitement to what was always going to be an epic adventure. So we disappeared inside one of the sheds. The roof was in a bad way. I was glad it wasn't raining. I was looking up at a BR Class 5 in awe, and I nearly tripped backwards over one of its rods lying on the ground. I was glad nobody had seen that. I wondered how a fitter could work in these dark, primitive conditions. I screwed up my courage and I climbed up into the cab. I gazed in awe at the arcane symbols of the engine driver's art. The regulator, gear wheel, and all the handles, gauges and valves. My worship, however, was interrupted by a sound. The fitter and probably his mate coming back. I had a sudden panic attack and scrambled off on the other side. As I wandered around, hearing trains run past, it began to dawn on me that the line through Patricroft was actually the original Liverpool to Manchester railway, the one that ran over Chat Moss. Here's a lithograph from the opening day, which actually shows a scene in Patricroft as the railway crossed the Bridgewater Canal. Looks a bit rural, eh? We were in the presence of railway history, and yet in our youthful ignorance, we'd been blissfully unaware of all that, although the presence of 19 or so steamers did tend to distract. I wasn't a great one for collecting numbers, unlike Dave. I liked to just stand and take in the sight of those great beasts, or take a couple of photos as they sighed and hissed like sleeping dragons. I do recall 7009 being on shed. Pretty clean too, and here's the proof. Alfred the Great, a Carlisle Kingmore loco, sans nameplates. Just what it was doing in Patricroft was anybody's guess. Neither Dave nor I had the front to ask. This isn't my photo, sadly, but that could well be Dave there. It looks just like him. There were some very old coaches behind the new shed, and a couple of sludge tenders marked "Return to Patricroft." This one looks like an 8-wheeled tender from an old LNY 7F 080. Quite a survival. I'm still not sure, is that sludge from loco boilers when they're washed out, or from a water softening plant? I didn't see one at the shed, but as I say, I was a bit distracted. In this view from the footbridge, that disused formation to the left of the old shed is the Patricroft to Clifton Colliery line, formerly known as the Molyneux or Black Harry line. The name was because the line had a tunnel 1,299 yards long, named, some say, after the swarthy boss of the navvies that built the tunnel. However, disaster struck early one morning on the 18th of April 1953. The rail tunnel collapsed, where a construction shaft had been improperly closed off, and 3 houses in Temple Drive, Swinton, were sucked down into the void. 7 people were involved, and 5 sadly lost their lives. The tunnel was filled in after that, but you can still just make out the parapet to the south entrance. Martin Zero has an excellent video about it, and I'll put a link in the description for you. So our first visit to Patricroft was pretty special, but we wanted more, and returned again, this time in a P Super. In a way this was handy, as we could dodge about unseen like wraiths between the locos, though it was difficult to see the numbers unless you got right up to them. Engines loomed, their dark, formless shapes as big as houses out of the fog. My imagination worked overtime, and I felt sure I'd seen a Duchess or a Great Central loco, until I was near enough to find out otherwise. We needed our heads examined wandering about a loco depot in those conditions. Nobody batted an eyelid either. I was told recently by a local chap that the bridge we went over to access the sheds was called the Bridge of Sighs by the loco men. They would return home over it carrying as much coal as they could stuff into their pockets and haversacks. The bridge Dave and I crossed was relatively modern, I think, whilst the original was rickety and groaned as you walked across. Who knows, perhaps that's where the name came from. This photo, taken on a very foggy day, shows the footbridge in the background. There was always some activity at Patricroft. Locos going off shed, with shouts and banter between the men, or locos returning for servicing. I remember a Class 5 going off and another driver coming to work shouting, "Bring us a stick of rock, Jim." I guess they must have been taking a train to Blackpool. There were also a good number of freights going past, usually 8F hauled. I went again a couple of weeks after the end of steam. I was on a bus spotting jaunt, but I went into the depot just to have a last look, really. To wallow in the sadness of it all, I guess. But to my surprise, there were still a couple of locos lying in the shed, their rods tied up on the footplate. I was overwhelmed with the stupidity of it all. The waste. A couple of diesels were frothing and rattling about, so I paid my last respects and walked away. Back then, I hadn't realised what an interesting place Patricroft was. I wish I could go back with a time machine and my digital camera. So, what's left of the sheds these days? Okay, it was never a beauty spot, except perhaps for us gricers. The footbridge is still there, but with ramps now, which is progress. That would have made pinching the coal a bit easier than all those steps. The rest of the site is now a business park, covered in throwaway warehouses. This view here, with the guy surrendering to the Google van, is taken roughly from the same location as this shot, with the two beauties outside. The ghost of the old shed is tormented by the endless roar of the M602 behind, as it takes freight back and forth between Liverpool and Manchester. From Google Earth, while you can still see the main Manchester to Liverpool line, just about everything else is difficult to make out. The canal's still there, at least. I've superimposed the loco depot on in red here. Also the Bolton line and the Clifton Black Harry line in black. Both these are submerged now in new development, although the Clifton line is a footpath over some of its length. Dr. Beeching would be delighted. Now, moving to the OS 1939 survey, how different the picture is. Either side of the shed, west and north, is covered in a mass of goods sidings. Ironic that these sidings are where UPS and DPD now have their depots. The wheel turns full circle. And the old Liverpool and Manchester line still prevails. Patricroft Station is a shadow of its former self, but now sees fast, clean electric trains as well as the odd steam special. There's a nice bit of artwork on the wall of the station by Mark Manell. It's a naive but touching poem about the old loco depot. Best not to look too closely at the loco depicted, but the thought was there. The information board in the same place mentions Jim Carter, the footplate photographer who worked from Patricroft. His photos are superb. There was a nice mural on the subway underneath the station too, which depicted Nasmyth's steam hammer. I'm just not sure if it's still there. So there we are, a few reminiscences of Patricroft, one of my favourite depots. And this is how I'd like to remember it. As always, thank you so much to the photographers who allowed me to use their work. I've put links to them in the description. And huge thanks to you for watching. Stay tuned for more stories of the old steam sheds very soon.